You are watching a brand new session, a live session from Hong Kong, where we learn from experts at the University of Hong Kong. Please tag your friends. Please hit share right now. We're live on Twitter, on Facebook. Please tag your friends so they can join us. Please hit share. Please hit retweet. This is a very important conversation on policy lessons from Asia with Professor Keiji Fukuda. Please do share this right now. Let's bring the whole world in. This is a global conversation. And we will take your questions using the hashtag AskHKUMed, hashtag AskHKUMed, and HKU COVID-19. Please hit share right now. Professor Keiji Fukuda is the director of the School of Public Health at the University of Hong Kong. Please tag and share with the world. Hello, everyone. It's 9 p.m. in Hong Kong, 2 p.m. in London, and 9 a.m. right here in New York City. Welcome to this live global conversation about the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Sree Sreenivasan, and I'm the Marshall Loeb Visiting Professor of Digital Innovation at the Stony Brook School of Journalism. I'm honored to moderate this discussion brought to you by the University of Hong Kong. This is part of a series for all of us to learn lessons from what's happening in Hong Kong and Asia. We've spoken to various fields and various experts in the fields of medicine, public health, and economics. Today, we're discussing policy lessons from Asia, and our guest is Professor Keiji Fukuda. He's director of the School of Public Health at the University of Hong Kong, and also a member of the expert advisory group that's advising the Hong Kong government on COVID-19 issues. Professor Fukuda was former Assistant Director General at the WHO, Special Advisor to the Director General on Pandemic Influenza, and was Director of the Global Influenza Program. At WHO, Professor Fukuda led field investigations related to global outbreaks such as SARS, MERS, and Ebola. Before joining WHO, he worked at the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, and there he led field teams that assisted Hong Kong during the emergence of avian influenza in 1997, and has worked closely with China on issues such as influenza surveillance, SARS, and influenza H7N9. He's a physician and received his BA from Oberlin College, his MD from the University of Vermont, his MPH or Master in Public Health from the University of California at Berkeley, and his EIS training from the CDC. Please welcome Professor Fukuda. Hello, sir. How are you?
Hi, Sree. Good. How are you?
Thank you for being here. It's 9 a.m. in New York. We're just getting started. End of a long day for you. Tell us how you're feeling. What is happening in Hong Kong right now, Professor?
Well, I'm feeling pretty good, and I'm delighted to be here, and excited about the discussion we'll have. In Hong Kong, we're coming off, hopefully, the tail end of a surge in cases, and we're all keeping our fingers crossed that the cases will still stay low. But I think, like everybody, we are really looking forward to the day when the outbreak will be over and we can get back to living life as we hope to live it. But anyways, we're all doing fine here.
Thank you, Professor. We also have some comments, people watching. I see Claire is watching from Turin, and she says today's conversation is going to be a treat. Tell us where you're watching from. Please hit share, folks, so that people around the world can join us. It's a real global conversation. Clara is in Milan, in Italy, which, of course, as we know, was the country that got a lot of attention with what was happening there. We have a chart that we're going to show you that kind of looks at where we are with the cases and deaths around the world. I know today we crossed the 2 million mark, but this is from the FT, so let's bring that up so you can reflect on it. Professor, as you look at this chart, what are you thinking? What do you feel when you see these numbers?
Well, I think it's interesting. We've all been looking at these kinds of maps for the last few months, and I think the size of the dots have sort of shifted. And, a few months ago, we would have been looking at Asia. And now, you know, we can't help but be looking at Europe and North America as where the heaviest activities are. You know, this is what comes to mind right now.
Sure, and we often talk about flattening the curve. And so let's look at some of the curves that are you know, shown on this map from around the world. Oh, this is the FT map that we recommend everybody check out daily. They put this out, this graphic. What are we understanding from looking at this?
Well, I think there's a couple of important things to pick out. One is that, you know, if we look at the line from China, you know, it should hearten us all that we can really bend the curve. It's not just talking about it, that it can be done. But I think that when we look to the curves which are highest up, such as the US and Italy, you know, it really points out that in different parts of the world, bending the curve is still not assured. And so I hope it really pushes everybody to keep up their efforts. It's hard to do after so many weeks of really, you know, very difficult work, but we have to keep doing it.
And we also have a chart that shows us what's happening in Hong Kong. What are your thoughts as you look at these numbers, and what are they telling us about Hong Kong itself?
Yeah, I think the curve is quite instructive and I think helpful for a lot of people to understand what's going on. If you look at that bottom curve there, which represents the cases which have been occurring in Hong Kong over the time, you can see that for the first period of time, ranging from January up to, I don't know, the middle part of March, the number of cases were relatively low. And then you see that big surge in cases. And, you know, at the time that started, I think everyone was wondering whether it was getting out of control in Hong Kong. And, you know, there was a similar surge of cases in other places like Singapore. But when you look at the colors, those blue colors are travelers. And what it really reflects is that as the pandemic has really become more active in all parts of the world, you know, in essence, people have wanted to go home. So most of those blue cases are people returning back to Hong Kong who have brought in infection. So in the last couple of weeks, about 75% of the cases have been related to travelers coming in from overseas. But it really, you know, you can understand that as things get more dicey overseas and people get worried, they want to go home. And so this is a challenge which is going to be faced by everybody everywhere.
Yeah, thank you.
But it is coming down, and I think that it's coming down in part because, you know, the reason for that curve going up has been studied by people in Hong Kong, and the government has really taken actions based on the information contained there. So very important to look at that.
Yes, folks, if you're watching right now, live or later, please follow HKUMed at HKUMed so that you can see all the latest information that they're tweeting out. We want people to have accurate, timely information, and that's why we're doing this series of conversations. You're listening to a conversation with Professor Keiji Fukuda, who's the director of the School of Public Health. We wanted folks to get to know you a little bit, Professor. Like me, you were born in Japan, and then you moved to America, and you ended up studying at Oberlin, a great liberal arts school in the United States. Talk us through your career a little bit, and then we've got lots of questions coming in. People are tweeting us with hashtag AskHKUMed, hashtag AskHKUMed, and please follow HKUMed on Twitter. Professor.
Well, Sree, you know, I think you've actually lived in Japan longer than I have. My family moved to the States when I was a baby, and as you mentioned, I grew up there. But for whatever reason, and I grew up in a very Asian family growing up, you know, I wanted to travel and see much of the world, and my parents let me do it. I still don't understand why, but they did let me do it. And, you know, so through my educational period, I did go see a number of different places, including Hong Kong. This was back in the 70s. But somehow my career has allowed me to keep traveling, and it's been one of the really big joys in my life. I've gotten to work with a lot of fantastic people in many countries around the world, and I continue to be able to do that by coming here to Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is one of the cities that I've really just enjoyed the most in my life. So I'm really glad to be here.
Have connections into the US and of course colleagues at the CDC. How do you think the CDC has done through this crisis?
Well, I think the CDC has had a tough time during this crisis. You know, the CDC, I see the CDC as one of the premier public health institutions in the world. It has a depth of expertise and history and experience that very few other organizations or institutions can match. But it did have some difficult times in the beginning with some snafus on the testing. And then I think that it has not had as much of a prominent role in the US as it normally would do in such a large outbreak. Nonetheless, I know my colleagues back there, and they continue to do the work which needs to get done. So they are applying, you know, their epidemiologic and laboratory expertise, and still doing the kinds of work that they've done with every major outbreak which has occurred in our lifetime. And so, so I think that they're still working very hard on this.
We have questions coming in from around the world, and people are just telling us where they're watching from. So let's show you. We have folks watching from all over the world, including Mara's watching from Toronto. And we also saw Fred's watching from Bangkok. And I saw someone from Brooklyn. There's Cynthia. So this is that global interconnectedness. Linda's watching from Long Island. And Professor, that's part of why we're in the situation, right? This connection where people get on planes and they work in other countries, and goods and services are exchanged all over, right? Like that's why, in part, we're in this situation.
Yeah, exactly. You know, in our lifetime, Sree, one of the, if not the major factor shaping outbreaks has been globalization. And, you know, globalization is partly travel, it's partly the way we're connected, the way our economies are linked together. But it's an interesting impact on outbreaks because it's both made it easier for these infections to travel around the world more quickly, but it's also given us the capacity to be able to respond more quickly than ever. And so COVID, this current situation, like every other outbreak that I've been involved with in the past couple of decades, exemplifies both sides of that. You know, we're working on science in ways which were not possible in the past. There are collaborations which are occurring much faster than would have occurred in the past. But we've also seen how quickly the fear of COVID, how quickly the infection itself has spread. And so you're right, this linkage, this interconnectedness is everything. It's both the threat side, but also our hopes for getting through this as well as possible.
Thank you. We've got several questions coming in. What are your thoughts on the talk about the U.S. cutting funding to WHO? As we mentioned, you used to work there. You were a senior official. You were in field teams. You understand WHO and the World Health Organization better than most of us. What is their role and this threat which may come true from the President of the United States?
Yeah, so this is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, you know, for today. I think the news is really unwelcome for several different reasons. I think, you know, first, Sree, it's really important to know that one of the lessons of the past, and this goes back to, say if we go back to the 1918 influenza pandemic, you know, Spanish flu, and every major outbreak since then has had one common lesson, which is that there is no country which can be an island in the face of large outbreaks like this. And that understanding has been the basis for some of the places that we've made the biggest breakthroughs in terms of addressing pandemics. And so it was the basis for countries to adopt the international health regulations in 2005. It was the basis for initiating in successfully completing another framework called the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework. And it was also the basis for this idea called global health security, basically that countries need to work together when faced with a common threat. All of that requires a multilateral approach. And if you're going to have a multilateral approach, then you need an organization, which is WHO, to be at the center of that group of countries working together. And so the news about potentially withdrawing the funding puts that at risk. The second thing is that all countries fundamentally depend on WHO. Whether it's visible or not, countries really need it. So big and rich countries like the US or China depend on WHO both to provide information and perspective, which they don't have on their own, but which is needed from the global community. Poor countries fundamentally depend on WHO for broader support, so policy support, guidance, but also material support, having experts come in from different countries, sometimes having pharmaceuticals sent to them from the private sector and so on, all of which is usually coordinated by WHO. But the third aspect of it, which really struck me, is that having worked in Geneva for a decade, you really see that different countries have a different role to play in dealing with public health issues at the global level. And the US has had a very important role in that. So if we think of things such as the smallpox or polio eradication programs, much of this was made possible because of the US's involvement in leadership and providing expertise, and providing political backing, and providing financial backing. And so it has really played an instrumental role in some of the most important actions that have been taken at the global level in terms of health. And so the announcement really marks a stepping away from that. So whether President Trump actually follows through or not, it's a little bit like the announcement when the US was indicated it would step away from the Paris Climate Agreement. It really sends a bad tremor through the international community. And in the long term, it's going to weaken both the US, which fundamentally depends on other countries in terms of addressing health issues, but it's also going to fundamentally weaken the world's ability to deal with these complex issues. So I hope he doesn't follow through on it. It's really quite bad news. We'll just have to see what happens.
Thank you, Professor. It seems to me that in the middle of a global pandemic is not the time to cut funding to the most important organization dealing with global pandemics. Folks, you're watching a conversation with Professor Keiji Fukuda, who is the director of the School of Public Health at the University of Hong Kong. We have hundreds of people watching now. There's so many people who would benefit from this conversation. Please share on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube. Tag your friends, hit share, hit retweet, and keep sending us questions and comments. We're using the hashtag AskHKUMed. You can also follow us on HKUMed. I'm at Sree, Sree on Twitter. We want to get your questions in, so please keep sending them along. Helen says, what do you think about herd immunity? How long would it take 70% of the Hong Kong population to get immune? So if you can just step back and peel back that question of herd immunity. It's one of those things we hear about. People think they know what it means, but they don't really know what it means.
Sure. So herd immunity is basically the idea that if enough people in a population get immunized or are immune against an infection, then it's just much harder for the infection to basically move around and infect people who are not immune. And so basically, if the herd if the levels of immunity are high enough, everybody benefits from it. And the idea is sound. The question is, how do you achieve it? So in essence, there are only two ways to achieve herd immunity. The population gets infected and develops immunity through the infection itself. And so that would basically mean having, COVID infections go through Hong Kong or different countries and infect a significant number of people. So we don't know the exact percentage for this infection, but most of the time modelers, for example, will assume it's going to be 60 or 70%, which is needed. The second way that this can happen, of course, is by vaccination. And so we have a number of companies working on vaccine development, although it's not realistic to expect to see the first of those vaccines until sometime next year. So I think that in a sense, we all would like to achieve levels of herd immunity, and we would like to achieve it through vaccination. The problem with natural infection, of course, is that with something like COVID, you can expect a lot of people to get very seriously ill. You can expect those seriously ill people to overwhelm hospitals, and you can also expect a lot of those people to die. So, in Hong Kong, we very much do not want to achieve herd immunity in an uncontrolled way, but really would like to make it through until we're able to get a vaccine here.
Thank you. We have so many questions and comments coming in. Let's go to this one. What is your prediction on a second wave in Asia, Singapore, Japan? We're seeing that already sort of happening in some places. So talk about that, please.
Yeah, I think that the way that I typically think about this issue is that how long are we going to be at risk for infection? I think that it's nice to imagine waves rolling in and rolling out, and sometimes people talk about having a single wave and hoping that we don't have additional waves, but that's really unlikely. And so in a place like Hong Kong, we have had low levels of infection for several different weeks. And then as I mentioned early on, we then had a surge in cases, several hundreds of cases over the past 4 or 5 weeks or so. And that surge in cases was caused by a large number of people returning to Hong Kong with infections. That same shape curve could have been caused by other reasons. It could have been caused by outbreaks occurring solely within Hong Kong. So right now, as far as we know, most of the people in most countries remain susceptible to infection by COVID. And so it's quite likely that even countries like China, which have reduced their infection rates down to quite low levels, remain at high risk for seeing additional infections occur in the future. And so I think that all of the countries in Asia, but all countries elsewhere, are going to be at risk for multiple waves of infections occurring over the next several months. And so the bottom line is that given that picture, the key things are to make sure that your surveillance systems, your monitoring systems are working as well as possible. And I think the most successful countries have really relied upon a lot of testing to help assess what the true situation is in the country. So yes, I do think that it's likely that we are going to see additional waves of infection. And the key thing is that in knowing that, make sure that we take the steps to reduce the harmful impact of those additional waves in the future.
You're listening to a conversation with Professor Keiji Fukuda, who's the director of the School of Public Health. We're so grateful to all of you for joining us. Please tag your friends. Please hit share. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us how you're feeling. And please follow at HKUMed on Twitter. And we're using the hashtag AskHKUMed. We have so many questions coming in, Professor. Let's see how many we can get through. Kalidas Girid says, what are the considerations for India's exit policy of lockdown? India has a population, as you know, 1.3 billion. And we should say, Professor, you were born in Japan, you studied in the US, but as you noted, you went to India and did some research there. You went to Hong Kong. So you know India. Tell us about its approach, and why is it, if I may add, that some of the countries where the regular other health outcomes and statistics are so poor, why are they doing pretty well on that chart we showed earlier? In fact, if we can pull up that chart again, we can show you where India is. We can show the audience that India in that chart with the curves is, you can look on the screen. In fact, you have to look to find it because it is not as prominent, but you can see it right above Austria and Ireland and India. There's that little cluster there. My instinct would be to imagine that India in health situations has, worse outcomes than they're having at the moment.
Well, Sree, yeah, a couple of thoughts on this. Well, one, when you look at those curves, let me just start there. It depends on your capacity to do testing, to know really what your infection rates are and how many cases that you have. So that's one key consideration, and India is a very big country. The second thing is that, that the size of the population and the way the governance in India really does make it very challenging. 1.3 billion people is a lot of people. In India, we have a federated governance system. We have a central government, but we also have very strong state governments. And in addition, in a place like India, we have a number of different languages and cultures. And so in many ways, it's a very complex country, more complex certainly than a place, say, like Hong Kong, which is geographically smaller and has fewer people. And I think that it's clear that if there are no efforts to try to reduce the spread of COVID within India, it could end up with a very large number of seriously ill people and people who have died. And I think that right now we appear to be just at the early parts of the outbreak in India, but the cases are beginning to increase rapidly. And as you know from exponential curves, they look like they start out slowly, but they can pick up speed very quickly. And so I think that the options for India are difficult. Currently, it's in a state of lockdown, and it's possible to do that for a short period of time. But how long that can be extended in India, I think, is a very real question. And my sense is that it's going to probably be difficult to treat India as a single entity in terms of trying to exit from some of those control measures, and that it may have to be done more or less on a state-by-state approach. In many ways, that is not optimal. It would be because you can have people traveling from one place to another, depending on what the control measures are. But again, given the complexity and size of India, it may be the only realistic option that it has.
Thank you, Professor. We're just looking through all the comments that are coming in. Let's do a shout out to the folks who are watching. I'll name the countries they're watching in. You'll tell us if you've been there or the states. We have somebody watching from Michigan. I'm sure you've been.
Sure.
How about Scotland?
No, never been to Scotland.
All right, we have to fix that, right? One of the things I'm trying to do is trying to think of where I will go after we're allowed to travel again, because I think people want to travel when they can, and it's something. We have somebody watching from the Upper West Side, right in my neighborhood. You've been to New York, of course, and spent time here.
New York's one of my favorite cities. I'm very fond of it.
Yeah, and it's you know what's happening here. We feel like we're the epicenter of the epicenter, and we'll have some questions about that coming through as well. So folks, keep telling us where you're watching from. We have someone watching from Kowloon right there in Hong Kong, so that's really nice. Where are you right now?
I am in my office.
And where is that situated so that people get a sense?
So the Hong Kong University's medicine faculty and the School of Public Health are located on the southern part of the island. So we are in an area called Pok Fulam. And if I look out my window in the daytime, it's too dark now, I can see the ocean. So very nice view from here.
Oh, that's terrific. Okay, here's a question from Andy on Facebook. And remember, we're on all the platforms, folks, so please share your questions. Tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing that. There's research from Harvard published in the academic journal Science that intermittent lockdown measures may have to be imposed till 2022. What do you think about that? And just generally, are you in the prognostication business? Do you try to make predictions, or how do you approach questions like this, and also this particular research, if you're familiar with it?
Well, let me try to take some of these. No, I'm not in the prognostication business, and I try to usually be as clever as I can to escape making any kind of predictions. But I think that the general idea that it will be necessary both to respond to the current situation by establishing control measures and then backing away from them when activity levels go down is realistic. You know, I think that the colleagues in Harvard have been also in working with some of the people from the school here and the university. And I think this idea of both suppressing and lifting over time, and until we are able to vaccinate a large part of the population, is realistic. And it's in essence what we're practicing here in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, you know, we started out with certain control measures. The activity was relatively low. And then when there was a surge in cases, the social distancing measures and the border control measures were stepped up. But I think now that the cases are coming down, and they have been down in the single digits for the last number of days, hopefully we can begin to lift some of those social distancing measures, and so people can be back to a more normal level of activity. But we also very much recognize that if there is another surge in cases for whatever reason, then that it may also be important or necessary to reestablish stronger social distancing measures. And so I think that this is kind of the idea of suppressing and relaxing control measures.
Thank you, Professor. We have comments, more comments, people watching from, again, Scotland. We have someone who is watching from Eastern India in West Bengal. We have Vancouver. You've been to all of these places, I'm sure. But we're also seeing, Professor, on social media, people saying vaccines are fake, being these trolling kind of comments and questions. How do you combat this kind of misinformation, disinformation that sometimes comes from unexpected places? We have seen medicines being recommended at the highest levels in some places. So can you talk about that, please? And then we have lots more questions coming in.
I think that in global public health, but it's now much more generalized, how to deal with misinformation has been one of the most difficult and really still unsolved problems. To be blunt, we don't really quite know how to counter all the misinformation out there. And as you know, it can come from highest levels. It can come from unnamed sources on the internet, and it can come in many different ways. This particular instance of vaccines, this has been the subject of a huge amount of misinformation for decades. There have been really strong efforts made to downplay, discredit the importance of vaccination, when in fact it has been really one of the major breakthroughs in public health history, the ability to protect people before they get infected. And I think that this kind of situation really requires authoritative sources of information. And so these can be well-established individuals, these can be well-established organizations, to really be quite active in terms of communicating what is truthful information and factual information, and trying to counter misinformation or untruths when they're encountered. But it is a very difficult job. And I think that some of the rumors that I hear about, and oftentimes they have to do with vaccines, are the same rumors that have come up during other outbreaks. During the 2009 influenza pandemic outbreak, there was a lot of misinformation about how these were vaccines intended, for example, to harm people in different countries, or were not suitable for various reasons. And I won't go into all of them, but it really is a common issue. And I think that we still don't really know how to deal so effectively with it.
Thank you, Professor. We have comments coming in from Malaysia to Indonesia to Denmark. So people are watching from all over the world. Folks, we have about 20 minutes or so with the professor. So get your comments in, get your questions in. If we don't get them all in, you know that we're following the hashtag #AskHKUMed and @HKUMed. Please keep sending us the questions, because we know these questions will continue to be important. Here's a question from Kizito Mayra, who says, we are hearing cases of those testing positive, yet they were discharged from hospitals after being treated, and they were negative in some countries. So there is this confusion. Some people seem to go home and then after being recovered and then pass away. Some people, it seems like they have it again after being negative. How is that possible? And doesn't that confuse everything?
Yeah, it is confusing, and it's a question which has come up a lot. And, not so long ago, there were a lot of questions about whether people were getting reinfected after, apparently getting over their illness. And, I think that the likelihood that there's real reinfection going on remains pretty low. However, it's not zero. There are studies which have come out showing that even when you have a measurable antibody response, your levels of neutralizing antibody can be quite low. And so whether that equates to having less immunity, remains to be resolved right now. But there are questions like that. And it's also clear that some people can remain antigen positive for longer than other people. Whether that equates into them being infectious is another question. And so I think that when people appear that they're better but they remain antigen positive, there may sometimes be testing errors. But I think the issue is right now there probably are people who remain antigen positive for longer than the majority of people. And again, whether they are infectious or not is another question.
And this is something that we will have to keep a close eye on, especially as these cases keep accumulating. Miji 707947, in a post-lockdown scenario, what is the way to protect seniors?
Well, I think the basic idea for protecting seniors, whether we're post-lockdown or in a lockdown, is very similar. I mean, in essence, we know that the elderly are the group of people who in general are at highest risk for developing serious disease and for dying from COVID. And so without having vaccine, the basic idea is that we want to keep these people as shielded from infections as much as is possible. And so in a post-lockdown period, still not going out and mixing with large numbers of people is prudent. I think a number of the public health or personal health measures which have been recommended, if you go out, wear a mask. If you are touching things, to make sure that you are washing your hands frequently, these kinds of steps are important. And then for friends and family members, if you are sick and it's possible that you could have COVID or in fact another infection, then staying away from your elderly relatives or friends is also an important step for protecting them. So these are things that one would recommend whether we're in a lockdown period or whether we're in a post-lockdown period.
Thank you, Professor. Folks, we have Professor Keiji Fukuda with us. Please share your questions. Tell us where you're watching from. We're on Facebook and Twitter. We want to hear from you. CF Kwan asks, Professor, what would you see the trend of public health research and prevention of another pandemic post-COVID-19? Where is all this going, Professor? And in an additional question, do you think this is going to spark more interest in the public health fields, in medicine? Is there going to be more interest, or are some people going to be worried, as we're seeing healthcare workers in some countries are 10, 15, 20% of the cases, like in the Netherlands, 25% of the cases are healthcare workers?
Sree, I think that COVID is going to change things in ways that we can't imagine right now. In many ways, I think that the questions raised by COVID is not only going to stimulate discussion and interest in how do we protect ourselves better against future pandemics, which are going to occur for sure, but also they're going to raise a number of other questions beyond that. Are we going to continue to have a multilateral approach to addressing crises? What does this mean in terms of governance? We've seen that a number of different countries with different forms of government have handled the response to the outbreak differently. We have seen that different measures such as electronic monitoring of individuals are being used in a number of different countries. In a sense, this is becoming a little bit normalized. So there are profound changes going on. And I think that in terms of research, beyond understanding the impact of the disease and understanding characteristics about the virus and the epidemiology and so on, I think that we are going to profoundly have to relook at what is the relationship between governance and culture and responding to these kinds of crisis situations. So I expect that this is going to lead to quite an explosion in research beyond any other kinds of outbreaks that we have seen in our lifetime. I hope it really brings us also to rethink through health systems. And we have seen that in the countries which have generally done the best, and I consider many of the countries in Asia to have done well so far, we have seen that a common denominator has been that they have had unified single-payer health systems, and countries which have struggled the most have had fragmented systems. And so I hope we have a generation of people that works towards improving those health systems, taking what we've learned from this current outbreak, applying it, and and I desperately hope this outbreak does not scare people about going into health, but really, if anything, galvanizes them, because I hope it shows the central importance of health to virtually all aspects of societal well-being. So really, I can't see where all of this is going to go, but I do believe that this is really the beginning of a quite profound evaluation of virtually everything.
Wow, that's in some ways it's good to know that there is a way to look at this, but it's also daunting considering how much fragmentation there is in the world. If we can just pull up again the chart that shows the curves, because we have a question about South Korea, Professor, and in that chart with these curves, we see that China is doing really well, and Korea never even went up as high as it could have, and it stayed. That, look at that line. What does that line tell us about Korea and the work that they have been able to do to make sure that curve stays where it is?
Well, if we go to Korea, as you remember, Korea really started off with a bang. There was a big outbreak of cases in the city of Daegu, Many of those cases were related to a cluster. And so it got off on it started off with a big explosion of cases. But what the South Koreans were able to do was apply many of the things that they learned from previous outbreaks. So I'm thinking of when the MERS outbreak occurred in Seoul in 2015, which also took Korea by surprise. What they did after that was to improve the public health system. So they made things like the Korea CDC more robust and stronger, and took other steps to improve the public health system. And you can see the benefits of that now. They learned how to do contact tracing, how to do case investigations better. They really applied that. And then they took their technological expertise and really used it to use testing at a very high degree. And that strategy paid off for them in both being able to monitor and to assess their situation very well. And these are some of the common elements that were used by South Korea to flatten the curve, if anything. And again, some of the other key elements that they had there is that they had good leadership, they had good communications with the public, explaining things pretty clearly to them. And so some of these are common elements to many of the countries in Asia. Each of these countries has sort of put together their recipe for dealing with COVID a little bit differently, but there are some common elements. But I think that looking at the lessons from Korea is very useful for other countries in terms of determining what might be employed in their own countries.
Thank you, Professor. We have a few minutes left with Professor Keiji Fukuda, who's the Director of Public Health at the School of Public Health at the University of Hong Kong, and he has worked at the WHO, worked at the CDC, has led field teams into studies of outbreaks such as SARS and MERS and Ebola. So he is really one of the world's top experts, and we're so grateful to have him here. Lina Santos asks, what studies have been made to determine how the virus will behave at high temperature or tropical countries? And Lena's watching from the Philippines.
Well, there's been both some studies done under controlled methods, and some of those have been done by investigators at Hong Kong University in our school here. And then there have been some other attempts to look at the survival and behavior of this virus under more natural conditions. And, if you look at the laboratory studies, for example, when the temperature goes up, when humidity goes up, and depending on the surface, the survival of the virus goes down. But under cool conditions and drier conditions, the virus can be quite robust in terms of surviving in the environment, and by robust, surviving for days. I think that the studies on natural infections, though, are not exactly the same as the laboratory studies. The laboratory studies, use things such as viruses in transport media, for example, whereas in the real world, the viruses are not going to be in transport media. And there, of course, there's been much speculation as to whether virus activity is going to be lower in the summer months or in the warmer months. But again, we have seen that the activity of the virus can be quite active in places like Australia, in warmer climates like Singapore. And so I think that we don't have any evidence that this virus cannot be highly infectious in warmer climates. It may be that it develops a seasonal pattern, but right now we're in a situation where the majority of people, the vast majority of people in the world, are susceptible to infection. And that probably is a strong enough factor right now to make sure that we'll continue to see activity regardless of seasonality. It may be in the future, like many other respiratory viruses, it settles into more of a seasonal picture, but we'll need a couple years to see whether that's true or not.
Thank you, Professor. We have just a few minutes left, so we're going to do quick questions and quick answers. The debate in the US about reopening the country or the economy, what kind of preparations are needed before reopening? Can you share the experiences from Asia?
Yeah, I think that, again, the US, like India, is a large country. It has a lot of different cultures within the country, and it has a political system which is both federated to a certain extent and centralized to a certain extent. Given that situation, I think there are some clear things that you want as you try to normalize activity. One of them is you want leadership at all levels, which is unified. You want clear messaging going out to people so they are not confused. You want to have a surveillance system which is able to actually monitor accurately what is going on. And so this, the US has greatly increased its testing capacity, but it can increase its testing capacity even more. And you need those sorts of capacities to be exerted. But I think fundamentally the question for all countries in terms of policy is, what is the balance that they will accept in terms of having disease control versus normalizing economic and societal activity? And choosing that is not a science question. It's really, what is it that is acceptable in that country? And that's going to vary from country to country. And the second issue for countries is that once you have an idea of what you're willing to accept in terms of trade-offs and that balance, is what are the means that you're willing to use to achieve that balance? And so, are you willing to use extensive testing? Are you willing to use extensive monitoring? And so on, in terms of going back to a more normalized level of activity. So the US has all the technical capacity in the world that it needs. I think it's missing, right now it is not on the same page in terms of being consistent with its messaging. And I think that these are some of the things which are going to be needed in the US before it can really move back optimally to normalizing activities.
Thank you, Doctor and Professor. We have so many questions and comments coming in, including folks who are quoting you, and especially when you said, no country is an island, and therefore you have to really think in that kind of global sense. We have lots of comments here. We also want to ask you a question about travel. Mr. Au asks, what would be the normal for coming years concerning travel before the world's population is immunized with the vaccine? And also, what percentage of the world needs to be immunized, have a vaccine, needs to be vaccinated before it would be considered that it's taken effect?
Okay, well, so this is a complicated question. I think that in terms of a crisis situation like COVID, there's both the crisis aspect of it, which is really the emotional and the urgent part of it, and then there's the actual disease control of the infection, and they're not necessarily the same thing. So that's one thing to understand. I think that as soon as we start getting vaccine coming out, even if the amounts are not enough to vaccinate some billions of people, that will do a lot towards really relieving much of the tension in the world and restoring, economies back and restoring confidence. In terms of how much of the population we want to vaccinate, again, presumably we're going to want to have a world which is relatively immune to COVID. So this is going to mean vaccinating some billions of people. Right now we're over 7 billion people now, so perhaps 3 or 4 billion people is where hopefully we can get to over the next, say, 4 or 5 years. And then in terms of travel before we have vaccine, this is going to push everybody to make a decision. If they're going to travel for a holiday and there are not vaccines available, well, how much is it worth it to them to travel somewhere versus the risk of getting infected? And that's going to be a person by person choice. And the same thing is going to exist for businesses. Right now, businesses have really expanded their operations so that they're communicating by electronic means. Will they prefer to do that, or would they prefer to have face-to-face meetings before vaccines are available? So again, I don't have a crystal ball about how people are going to decide about these things, but these are some of the issues that people will face in deciding about whether to travel or not.
Thank you, Professor. We have just a couple of minutes left. I'm just going to read you maybe a couple of questions, and then you can synthesize them together. Winnie Mary is watching from London, and she says, we have strong resistance from UK scientists and medical advisors for preventive measures such as mask wearing. They argue that if you wear a mask, you can't drink tea. People feel too insecure or too secure and touch their face, and the virus may drive the mask may drive the virus inside the mask. All of this stuff is, I think there's a fundamental East Asia and American and maybe UK also division on this, right? Like I think in East Asia, you wear a mask, it's sign of politeness because you don't want other people to get sick. In America, if you wear a mask, people like, even today, even as much as there are masks being used, you see people kind of think that there's a problem if you're wearing a mask. Can you talk about that since you've lived in both cultures?
Yeah, probably I can't think of anything more in global public health that I've been involved with which has divided people so much as masks. And this is going back before COVID. And there is something deeply cultural about masks. I would say that the scientific evidence now is weighted in favor of wearing masks. I think a while ago I would have said it was really more neutral, but it is not weighted so much that you can simply say that wearing masks is going to be the answer for preventing infections. It's one part of many other steps that you need to be taking to reducing infections. But in Asia and in Hong Kong, yes, we wear masks pretty commonly for the reasons that you cited. One, we believe that it reduces infections and reduces the likelihood of infection. Two, I think it's a signal to other people that you are concerned about their health and so on, and there's something culturally supportive about that. And I think that these are important aspects of how we behave when we're in a crisis situation. And three, it is very clear with COVID that there are a significant number of people who can be infected, who don't have symptoms, but could be exposing other people to virus. And here, the evidence is quite strong that wearing masks can be helpful. So I think that, the culture and the culture of wearing masks is apt to change slowly. Culture is never anything which never changes overnight. But I think that the example set by Asian countries is probably being noted by many other populations. And so there are many people in the West who are now beginning to wear masks on a regular basis. And so I think that this is one of the places where we may end up seeing significant change on the basis of the COVID experience.
Thank you. Let's go with this as the last question for now. And we're so grateful to you, Professor, for being with us. How are you preparing the next batch of medical and public health students in light of COVID-19 at the University of Hong Kong? How is the education impacted, and what is going to happen going forward? How are international students going to be treated, not just at the University of Hong Kong? How do students in China or India or Australia decide to get on a plane and go to America this fall, as you know, when the semesters start?
Well, COVID has had a major disrupting effect on education in Hong Kong. In the first place, many of the schools, including the universities, have been shut down without face-to-face classes for some months now. And what this has led to is moving many of the classes onto electronic platforms. And so we have really accelerated that process. And so that has probably been the major adaptation. We've tried to continue courses, keeping them on schedule as much as possible, but really moving the teaching. So tutoring is done online. Small group discussions can be done online, and making those kinds of adaptations. It has been difficult for students who are overseas to return because travel is so disrupted. And but on the plus side, you know, COVID also has opened up research opportunities, and so we've tried to make those opportunities as available as possible to students who are interested in researching some aspect of COVID, so at least taking advantage of the situation. But you know, I think bottom line is that we are all hoping for the day when we can go back to having face-to-face classes. I think that it's nice to do a lot of the teaching online, but it's also very nice to see people in a class and just to be able to talk with them. So.
Professor, one of the things that I will ask you to kind of reflect on as we say goodbye here is where do you think we go from this? What are the immediate and then long-term things we should all be thinking about? Kind of your final words for now.
I think that in the immediate, hopefully we all have seen that when we're in a crisis situation, you know, you really depend on other people. You depend on your family, you depend on your friends, you depend on your colleagues. And in many ways, COVID has conspired to keep us separate. You know, we have tried to employ social distancing and, you know, successfully done those kinds of things. But at the same time, I think for many of us, it is really deeply underscored how much we are connected and care about other people. And I think that is an incredibly valuable thing which COVID has given to us, because we do live in a kind of 24/7 world, and particularly in a very busy place like Hong Kong. And so I think it has underscored the importance of those connections that we have each other. In the long run, I do think some of the issues which I mentioned earlier are very germane. COVID somehow has exposed that we are vulnerable in many different ways, that how we did business in the past is not necessarily the best way for doing business in the future. And we are going to really fundamentally have to rethink through a lot of things about how we live in society. And I think that this will take a while to sort through, but I do hope that in this globalized world, we get the contributions from everybody about this, because I do think that you know, the world tomorrow is not going to be the same as before COVID.
Thank you, Professor. It's 10 p.m., past 10 p.m. in Hong Kong. You've had a long day. We're so grateful to you. I'm just going to reintroduce you because we have people catching up at the end of this segment, and then they'll watch the replay. We want them to go back and watch the replay. So you don't see this on television where you reintroduce the person at the very end, but I'm going to do this because that's one of the things we've learned about this new way of communicating. We want people to go back and watch the show. So our guest in this series from the University of Hong Kong, so that we can learn from around the world, is Professor Keiji Fukuda, who is the director of the School of Public Health at the University of Hong Kong. He's also a member of the expert advisory group that advises the Hong Kong government on the COVID-19 epidemic. He's a former Assistant Director General of the WHO and a special advisor to the Director General on pandemic influenza, and also director of the Global Influenza Program. And we should note that the director has said today, in response to the confusion around President Trump's statements, that their focus, WHO is, on tackling COVID-19 and is not going to be distracted on other issues. At WHO, Dr. Fukuda also led field investigations related to SARS, MERS, and Ebola. And he's a physician, and he studied at Oberlin, the University of Vermont, California, Berkeley, and at the CDC. So he's had so much global experience, one of the top experts on pandemics, and this pandemic in particular. Professor, I'm so grateful. Thank you on behalf of people watching around the world. It's been great to have you with us. We're so thankful to you and to your colleagues for sharing useful, accurate information. And for everybody watching, please follow at HKUMed, and please keep sending your questions with the hashtag AskHKUMed. And my name is Sree Sreenivasan. I'm a professor of digital innovation at the university, at Stony Brook University School of Journalism. And I'm just very grateful to have this opportunity to meet a fellow Tokyo-born professor. He was born in Tokyo, as was I. He now lives in Hong Kong. He's an American in Hong Kong, and I'm an American here in New York City. Two great cities of the world connected at this terrible time, but we're going to emerge stronger. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you. Have a good morning.
Good morning and good night. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Wow.